Well, good morning, everyone. This mask that I'm wearing is due to synchronicity or serendipity. I don't know what. I was recently at a performance of a show put on by Submersive Productions in Baltimore, and they took over the National Aquarium for an entire night with 100 or 150 actors, and they ended up auctioning off 4 of the masks that they had created. And I just fell in love with this particular mask. And then when I thought, gee, I have to do a reading, what story should I read? I realized I had a story from the point of view of a fish, about a fish, and from the point of view of the fish. So I said, well, this is the perfect opportunity to put this mask on. And it's echoey for me. I don't know how echoey it might be for you, and maybe the echoing helps. It makes it sound more interesting or more Orson Welles-like, I don't know. But the story, which is sitting in the market and I'm still waiting to hear, but the story I like very much, is called The Only Thing Older, The Only Thing Wiser. The sea he swam through was a lonely place, for only the young and stupid remained. And it didn't matter how old the others were, or how smart the years had made them. Compared to him, they were all young and stupid. There was only one thing older, there was only one thing wiser, the sea itself. He long ago tired of the others who sliced through the waters around him, for they only reminded him of those who existed, but who existed no longer, before he came to understand that essential truth about himself. Because of his weariness, he'd spend most of his days as far from them as he could, in the darkness of whatever depths he was capable of reaching without being crushed by the pressure. Unfortunately, all he ever got out of hiding from those who thankfully couldn't follow him and continued to live was yet another sort of loneliness. The one difference between those two states of solitude was he'd feel less annoyed at what he'd become whenever he settled down distant from the others, walling himself off from the constant reminder of what his forever was going to taste like. From time to time, he'd shrug off that despair and swim near the surface, ignoring along the way any who'd come close and were more curious about him than he'd been about any of them for ages. He then surrendered to the tide, letting himself be carried to the fringes of the shore, but not so close any of those who walked upon the land above, the children of the children of the children who once upon a time decided it would be preferable to exist in air rather than water, could reach down and pluck him from his home. He'd had so many close calls over the centuries, he'd learned how to elude them easily. Time, he discovered, could be a great teacher, though some of its lessons were less welcome than others. As much as he longed to join those who lived on the land their ancestors chose, he understood he'd never survive there, for that's not how such transformations were achieved. He knew that fact from his snout to his tail, having witnessed every step of each transition along the way, while remaining always and ever himself. The journey others had taken, while he'd stayed the same, took generations, not a single moment, nor a single lifetime, not even one as long as his. No matter. He still liked to look up at them there on the land from time to time, those who'd escaped from the sea without having realized they'd done so. They lived in ignorance because their leap had taken place millennia before. But unlike them, he was not equally as ignorant of where they'd come from or who their ancestors had been. He knew their history because he'd seen it. He'd been there when it happened. It was his mutant cousins who'd borne them upward, and without such they'd all still be down with him in the wet. That lack of knowledge allowed them the freedom of ingratitude for the serendipitous glitch which had led them to who they were, the ones who owned the world above, a land he longed for even though there was much less of it above than below. It had taken the current air breathers generations without number to arrive there, and even then only thanks to a near impossible combination of time and luck. Yet even knowing that, and knowing how ridiculous it was to bother, he'd often find himself thinking, why couldn't he be equally as lucky? He lived 100 generations of the lifespans of what they'd become, 1,000, more perhaps. He long before lost count. So why couldn't he change the way his species had and be up there with them? Or if not, if that sort of spontaneous leap forward was not possible, since centuries of wanting it to be so hadn't been enough to deliver him there, and no matter how much he wished to fool himself, he knew such yearning to be a fantasy, couldn't he at least die? But both possibilities seemed beyond his reach. And he knew that was so because he frequently tried to bring about that latter end. For months he'd cease from moving, stop his feeding. Then he'd spend his days putting himself in the paths of creatures larger than himself, only to have them do nothing more than poke him aside, slap him with their tails to show their disdain, and swim off. He'd seek out every crack and crevice he could find in the ocean floor, but none was ever deep enough to explode his tomorrows. Or else he'd propel himself as high from the sea as he could, hoping he might remain aloft long enough to be seared and sensate by the sun, but none of his ploys had worked. He'd made every attempt to end himself, save one. He could never find the will to bring himself close enough to the shore so those above with their nets, then spears, then hooks could end him. He sensed it would be wrong to go out that way at the hands of those he could not help but think of as his descendants. So after those visits to stare upon the surface dwellers for as long as he could bear, overwhelmed by jealousy, not envy, but jealousy, for time had taught him the difference, he would retreat to the bottom and sulk among the silt. Long ago and far away, when nothing lived above the ceiling of the sea, for none who lived below that ceiling had yet escaped its embrace, he was a fish like any other. He spent the cycles of his existence unaware for the most part of the passage of time, each day for him much like the rest. He swam, he ate, he fertilized, he enjoyed the trickle of water through his gills, he hid from predators, he danced along the empty shore, intrigued by its promise, but aware that upper part of the universe was forbidden to him. And most importantly, he survived. But then he noticed differences appearing in those who came into existence around him, differences at first subtle and therefore capable of being ignored, but eventually becoming both undeniable and unexplainable. When that eventually began, he could never quite pinpoint, no matter how hard he tried. His first hint something odd was in the offing happened when he could no longer find any of his familiar companions within the school. At first he assumed they were merely elsewhere among his swarm, moving around the distant edges. After searching among them and through, he realized they were gone, all of them. He couldn't understand how he lost every one by one, without having been aware of the attrition. How could that have happened? He was a survivor, he knew that, for he always kept his wits about him. That level of alertness should have left him informed. So to be the last of his cohort without having noticed he was becoming so seemed wrong. Not so wrong that first stage couldn't continually be explained away due to chance alone, however. Not so wrong it implied anything catastrophic to his status quo. No, that second sort of awareness didn't arise until he noticed strange bumps and protuberances on some of the latest generation who swam the sea. The natures of those newer ones changed with the tide, seemingly useless at first, mere warts and other random growths, but then the grotesque began to abound around him, spotting some who gained extra fins where no fins should exist, others whose rows of flippers ended bony and flailing, and some with tails splintered and unable to ever catch the waves, all senseless changes which impeded rather than aided the survival of their owners. The useless alterations to the new life forms around them made it more difficult for them to swim, more difficult for them to feed, more difficult for them to escape. He had no sense of how long this proliferation continued, as his relationship to time seemed to have broken, but regardless of how many months and years had passed, the increasing number of foreign bodies came to frighten him. For though the random appendages were at first relatively rare, they soon appeared in greater number and with even wider and more monstrous variables, causing greater discomfort not just to those who bore them, but to him as well from their mere existence alone. What turned his initial curiosity to fear was the thought it was likely all the result of a contagion which would soon take him as well. And the effects of whatever was occurring eventually worsened, for he began to see, during his occasional trips to wander along the shore, trips which had then become less frequent because it was in the midst of it all he began his deep dives to hide, the skin and bones which were all that remained of those who had, in what must have been an infected badness, thrown themselves there. He felt sorry for the lost ones, but he felt sorry for himself because he did not want to end up as they had. So he endeavored to stay as long as possible in those favorite hiding places where, to his great relief, he avoided their fate, coming out only when the need to feed was unbearable, which to his surprise was not as often as it had been in the past, though strangely he felt no more the sluggish for it. He behaved that way until the day the wave of change suddenly ceased. the disappearance of the bizarre mutations making as little sense as their arrival. He attempted to forget them, the discomforting strangers, and go on with his normal life. He sought out new friends, friends with whom together he formed a new school to swim with when in the mood. The group did not have him feeling quite the same as in the old days, for those whom within their midst he found himself were not like those he'd known, but at least they were still to his mind fish as fish were meant to be, with no alarming changes, and they were company, or so he forced himself to believe, and for a while he felt less lonely. But though he tried to act as if all was as it once had been, he knew it was not, for he finally came to realize what he'd long tried to ignore, that the world which existed outside his scales was not the only thing which had changed. Because though he was no longer hungry and rarely ate, he didn't starve. The urge to procreate had also withered, so he no longer sought to find more with whom he could make copies of himself. He pondered this as others were born around him only to pass, a cycle of life which seemed to have slipped him entirely until he finally knew some great change had occurred deep inside him, and though his was a less visible metamorphosis than the surface growths which had occurred to the others, it was no less profound. His time, he was astonished to realize, should have ended generations before, but how long before he doubted he would ever know. The length of his current lifespan and the exact instant he had gone past his expected years were merely two more mysteries to be added to the litany of the unnoticed. He hadn't, in the days prior to that period of revelation, approached the shore for a great while because it saddened him to confront the evidence of how many had lost their lives. But whatever change had gone through him seemed to have changed the nature of his reluctance as well, and so once he had finally noticed those feelings which had kept him away had vanished, he returned only to discover the shore was not as it had been. The remains of those who had hurled themselves through the ceiling of his world had gone. And up above in the deadly part of the universe, he could see the shore was not so barren as it had once been, because things moved. Things had never moved up there before. He drew closer to the land, which was when a net was thrown across the sky, and then he dodged quickly as it fell. Never before had anything above attempted to breach down below. He chose not to return to the shoreline for a long time thereafter, pondering all the while what had happened to change the nature of his heavens. And the only possibility which occurred to him was preposterous. Could some of those who had been made freakish and useless have hurled themselves above only to survive, thrive, and prosper, becoming the creatures which had hunted him? Surely a thing could not be, and surely if it could be, it was wrong. That they existed was an affront to the life he lived and the world he knew. And so he tried to forget them, but no matter how he attempted to distract himself in the new sea which had replaced the old, could not. The notion of strangers above pulled at him, the silent call of their existence piercing his days of pretense that all was as before. And so he eventually returned to that boundary where he for the first time saw other swimmers who were neither as fast nor as lucky as he had been, fail to escape the nets and other implements of destruction which came later. As he fled from the shore then, he felt lonelier than the centuries, he knew now it had indeed been centuries, had made him before. He would from time to time during the darkest of days find himself dreaming of being a mutant himself and somehow bringing into being exterior changes to match the ones which had been forged inside him, but knew such dreams were false. That wasn't, he told himself again, how things happened. The more he wished to join the upper world and the stronger his longing, the more the ones around him felt even more distant strangers to him by contrast. Those were the days when his despair grew so great he longed for death and began trying to end himself in all the ways he could conceive except the obvious. That darkness came to him not simply because the conditions of his life were severe, but due to the fact that life of his was apparently eternal, making it even worse. Shouldn't there be joy in the gift of years beyond measure? But no such joy ever arrived, and eventually, even worse, none was ever anticipated. So as those years became centuries and all the treasures the sea had to offer became as nothing to him, he knew it was time to once again and for the final time face what waited for him, what waited for us all at the shore. Once his decision was made, he swam there without pause, not caring what would happen next, so long as it brought oblivion. He presented himself belly up in shallow waters, welcoming the net, the spear, the hook, whichever would greet him to bring about the end of time, but to his surprise, only the living descended into the water. Two cupped hands, their curved fingers forming a shallow ball. Without hesitation, he wriggled forward and settled inside him. He turned and looked back toward the deep, not knowing if this was goodbye to his home, but fully prepared for it to be so. and then he was lifted up into the light. And I believe I will stop there. If you want to find out what happens next, well, hopefully the market to which it has been sent will be accepted by that market. And do you have any questions or anything you wish to know about? I should point out the name of the person who designed this mask. So Jacob Marino designed this mask as part of the performance that was put on by Submersive Productions. You should all go to the Submersive Productions website if you're ever in the Baltimore area, see one of their magnificent immersive productions. But that being said, does anyone have a question of any kind?